So we have Dr. Daire OhUallachain is Senior Research Officer in Ecology and Water Quality at Teagasc, which is the state agency providing research, advisory and education in agriculture, horticulture, food and rural development. And he's going to give us an overview of those policies, programmes and practices. So Gurmila Mahagas Daire.
Gurmai Gadivi and Gasukahinta Van Shot live Eleginu, Mila Buikas and Kuru. I'm delighted to be here to present to you. I should note I've nothing to do with UCD, so Evie, you're off the hook. So, an overview of some of the policies, programmes and practices that are working in this space in relation to agricultural biodiversity. So, Teagasc are the national public body providing integrated research, advice, education and training services to the Irish agri-food sector. And one of our key objectives is to provide science-based evidence and technologies to enable Ireland to meet its commitments in regard to gaseous emissions, for example, water quality and biodiversity. So Helen has stolen a little bit of my thunder now with the next slide or two, so I'll go through pretty quickly in relation to a brief overview of our agricultural systems and our land use. As Helen says, agricultural land use is the dominant land use in Ireland. 68% of our land area is dedicated to agriculture, significantly higher than the EU average, which is about 40%. As Helen said, most of this is grassland, about 92%. Forestry is at about 11% of our land area, and again, this is significantly less than the EU average, which again is about 40%. In relation to our livestock, as Helen said, we've 7.3 million cattle as of CSO figures June 2020. Dairy systems are dominating in the south and the southeast. Beef systems predominantly in the Midlands, but throughout the country also. And as you move further west, we're getting more and more sheep systems, for example, and in the uplands. And I think an important message here is that there's significant variability in our farming systems, as Helen has demonstrated there. So, also, not only have we difference in our farming systems, but we've difference in the landscape throughout the country. So there's huge variability in our landscape, in relation to our soil type, for example. And it doesn't matter that we don't have a legend here. We can see that there's a difference in different soils throughout the country. There's a difference in our geology and the underlying bedrock that we have. Again, huge difference throughout the country. Helen showed her rainfall getting wetter the further west we go. And what about differences in relation to habitat quantity, habitat quality and habitat diversity? We don't know. We don't have a national landscape map. We do have good enough, or we do have very good data, I suppose, in relation to a small proportion of the countryside. So Andy Bleasdale from the NPWS would have shared a map like this with you previously, showing good information in relation to our designated sites. But these designated sites only constitute maybe 14 or 15% of the land area, so there's a big chunk of land with very little information. In the absence of information, we're depending on creating maps based on indicators, species, for example, and we've created maps of areas that are likely to have high nature value farms. So again, as Helen showed, high nature likelihood farms here, up to about 30% of the land area. But we still need this national landscape map because it's important that we start directing the right measure from a biodiversity point of view to the right place. And in the absence of data, we're not able to do that. Also, the advantage of the national landscape map, it can start telling us about how our landscape performs in relation to delivering various ecosystem goods and services. And again, Helen touched on this, ecosystem goods and services that our land can produce in relation to provisioning services, such as food and fuel, in relation to regulatory services, such as climate or water, in relation to our cultural services that were touched on earlier as well, in relation to aesthetics or recreational, and also in relation to our supporting services. And again, important to note here, significant variability in landscapes and in their ability to deliver these various different ecosystem services. And we can't expect the one piece of land to deliver all of these ecosystem services. And additionally, we need to be cognizant that some of these ecosystem services attract a higher financial incentive than others. So against that backdrop, there are various demands on our land base. And we need to try and strike a balance between the economic, societal, and environmental concerns. We need to address the sustainability challenge of meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So the three legs of the stool for sustainability being economic, environmental, and societal. And again, we need to be cognizant that different farms are going to face different sustainability challenges. The sustainability challenge faced by an intensive dairy farm in the lowlands is going to be very different than the sustainability challenge faced by an extensive or a low-level sheep farm in the uplands. So we need to be cognizant of this variability in landscape and the challenges associated with landscape and different farming types. So against that backdrop and recognizing the various challenges associated with sustainability, we're seeing an increasing suite of policies and strategies trying to address these sustainability challenges. So you would have heard about the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, trying to address biodiversity. More recently, we would have seen the Climate Action Plan in relation to climate sustainability. Or we would have seen Water Quality Action or Water Framework Directive, as mentioned yesterday in water quality reports, addressing water quality. Or agronomic sustainability being addressed through food vision. And this is only a small subset of a wide array of different policies that are there in relation to sustainability, each with their own objective, all of which are leading to a very complicated, complex policy environment. And biodiversity is only one objective within this very complicated, complex environment. And where you have a complex environment like this, okay, there are opportunities for synergies where there are going to be multiple environmental or multiple ecosystem services being delivered by the one policy or by the one piece of land. And that's fantastic where those occur. But also we're going to start seeing trade-offs, where one ecosystem service comes at the cost of another ecosystem service. And this is because of our complex policy environment. So some of the challenges that we are associating within this policy space now is how do we address conflicting or competing policies in relation to sustainability objectives? How do we address how policies change and how they change rapidly over time? Also, and associated with that, how do we address the short-term, short-sighted strategies that are only lasting for a couple of years and not focusing on a longer-term vision? Other challenges because of a complex policy environment is that different policies will have different ambitions and different policies will be more effective than other policies. And again, this goes back to our competing policies. And again, another challenge here is data availability. Do we have enough data to help inform these various policies in relation to addressing the right measure to the right place? Sorry, one sec. So, where has that left us? Well, we're seeing increasing focus on ecological concerns within our policy. And more recently, we're seeing a drive for greater integration of ecological and agronomic policies, for example. We saw the EU Biodiversity Strategy and the Farm to Fork Strategy being launched under one day and heavily integrated with one another. And these policies have indicated a direction of travel for environmental policy and for agricultural policy, for example. And elements of these policies have been used to inform the current agricultural policy, the common agricultural policy that we have at the minute. And within this policy, we have our economic objectives, we have our environmental objectives, one of which key one is biodiversity, and then we also have our socio-economic policy and socio-economic objectives. But it's also important that we learn when we're addressing new policy that we start learning from previous policy, from the successes and failures of previous policy. And recently, the EU Court of Auditors commented and stated that most CAP funding to date has had little positive impact on biodiversity at an EU scale. So, now that we have enhanced ambitions from a biodiversity point of view within our policy, the challenge is to deliver on this enhanced biodiversity within the future CAP or within the forthcoming CAP. So how does the CAP strive for this? How does the CAP address these biodiversity challenges? So the CAP is divided into two main pillars. Pillar 1, direct payments or sectoral interventions, all of the money, €6 billion over the next 5 years, all of it coming from the EU. Pillar 2 is looking at rural development, about €4 billion over the next 5 years, 2/3 of which is coming from the Irish Exchequer and the remainder is coming from the EU. So it's a significant amount of resources over the next 5 years, €10 billion over the next 5 years. And because there are enhanced biodiversity ambitions within the CAP, and because agriculture is the dominant land use, 75% of all biodiversity expenditure in Ireland is associated with agriculture, predominantly through the CAP. So, this is going to inform the strategies for biodiversity and has informed the green architecture, how we are going to incorporate biodiversity within objectives of the CAP. And within this green architecture, there are three main building blocks. There is conditionality, and I'll speak about this now in a second. There is ecosystems or eco-schemes, which sits on top of conditionality, and then we have climate and environmental interventions. And as Helen spoke about opportunities for habitat quantity and habitat quality, you could crudely say that there are opportunities to enhance habitat quantity within the eco-schemes and within conditionality, and then there's opportunities to enhance habitat quality within the climate or environmental interventions. So, currently, CAP Green Architecture Pillar 1, conditionality. It's the baseline requirement for farmers in receipt of CAP payments, and most farmers in the country are in receipt of CAP payments. So it looks at, for example, farmers must undertake good agricultural and environmental condition measures. For example, retention of landscape features, retention of hedgerows, which Shirley Clarkin would have mentioned in a previous presentation to you. More recently, as part of this conditionality that all farmers must abide by, we're seeing minimum share or space for nature that Helen alluded to. So setting this threshold of 4% of a farm area as a space for nature. How are we prepared for this from an agricultural point of view? Well, as Helen said, on average, on more intensive farms, the average farm area ranges at about 6 or 7% and goes up to about over 30% on more extensively managed farms. The second building block of our green architecture is eco-schemes. And again, this builds on conditionality. So here we're seeing, for example, space for nature, enhanced space for nature ambitions, going to 7 or 10%. We're looking at planting additional native trees and hedgerows, and we're looking at additional environmental measures. Sitting on top of this again, then we have our climate and environmental interventions, Pillar 2. These are optional measures. They're predominantly 1.5 billion being associated with this. Currently in the acres, the Agri-Climate Rural Environmental Scheme. And again, there's split between two main schemes. There's the general scheme, 750 million. There's a lot of figures here. So 750 million, 30,000 farmers with kind of targeted but more general actions. And then more recently, we're seeing acres cooperation projects, 750 million again, targeting high priority landscapes. And it's got results-based payments. And this is locally led. We know that locally led, results-based approaches are vital for species, and particularly for species in habitats of conservation concern. So how does that look when we start putting policy into practice? And we've broad experience in building policy into practice and looking at locally led, results-based approaches. This is predominantly through European Innovative Partnerships, EIPs, where farmers and scientists and advisors and other experts all work together to develop practices that are sustainable economically and environmentally. And we've a good landscape of EIPs in Ireland. This frame is a little bit old and shows the first 20 or so EIPs throughout the country, locally led approaches driven by farmers with support from advisors, targeting local challenges, such as, for example, Suez EIP looking at uplands and extensive sheep, or Bride EIP down in Cork looking at the lowlands and intensive dairy, or national scale measures such as the Hen Harrier scheme looking at terrestrial habitats, Pearl Mussel scheme, looking at aquatic species, and then Danu looking at organic, or looking at start going below ground and looking at soil. So the lessons we've learned from the EIP is that farmers can address biodiversity if they are supported by advisors and other stakeholders. Key message here is that we need local specific objectives and targets, and this is driven by local relevant knowledge and local data. We need tailored payment structures. The more of an ecosystem service you deliver, the higher the payment you should be getting. And that's the key basis of the results-based approaches. We also know that specialised farm advisors and farmers are key influencers here. So we know that there are opportunities to scale up from these EIPs, and from Teagasc knowledge in relation to knowledge transfer to farmers, we know that farming practices are influenced by farm advisors. Most farmers have a farm advisors, and there's opportunities here to change practice on a biodiversity point of view. Key elements in relation to knowledge transfer include discussion groups, and also there are multiple other ways of disseminating knowledge to farmers, through the media, for example, through national events, webinars, and demonstration. So we need to start incorporating effective knowledge transfer and continue to incorporate effective knowledge transfer approaches in support of our biodiversity objectives. So as a summary of all of this last 10 slides or so, what are the key messages we can start considering here? Well, agriculture is the dominant land use in Ireland. CAP is the dominant budget for agriculture and the environment. So nature conservation is dependent on farm-scale efforts, which would be guided by effective policy and implementation. Linked with that, we then need timely, evidence-based monitoring of this policy effectiveness, and this is really, really critical. It's critical we have this timely monitoring to identify those measures and schemes that are working, which is fantastic, but also to identify those measures and schemes that have deficiencies, so such these deficiencies can then be rectified. Farms differ, landscapes differ, biodiversity challenges differ, responses will differ, advice differs. One size does not fit all, as Helen also alluded to. We need data to address these blind spots that we currently have in the countryside. We need further information about biodiversity, about the functioning of biodiversity, about delivery of ecosystem services, and particularly about biodiversity below ground. And this will help inform the right measure and the right place. We need to utilize multiple methods of knowledge transfer. And also, we need to be cognizant that we have a very complex policy environment. It's hard to have clarity of purpose for biodiversity objectives when it is only one objective in a suite of other environmental and economic and societal objectives. We need to strive for greater policy coherence, incorporating multiple stakeholders, whilst being cognizant that there might be shortfalls or organisational capacity deficiencies to address some of these challenges. We need to build on the lessons learned of the schemes that we have seen and the EIPs that we have seen working, and then we also start looking at greater coherence in relation to valuing our various ecosystem services. Gurmil Mailagi.